give you the introduction to the book that I've prepared called The Second Sinai. And I'm really excited about getting it done. And I've spent a lot of time really analyzing what am I going to produce and what is the purpose? And it's clearly, I hope, not about the information, but about an encouragement to start a process. And I can explain as we go along. The book, as I told you guys earlier, many weeks ago, when I was sitting at Shabbos table, I just got this uh, intuition, this download of an idea about the Second Sinai concept, and I shared it with an amazing rabbi in Forest Hills, New York, from Young Israel, and he and I had this discussion about it. He gave me the different sources to look at, to examine, and of course I did. And this started a whole experience of looking at the text, looking at what the sages, looking at what the rabbis say, and realize that we're sitting right now at the beginning of a second Sinai moment that I do believe deep within my being. And it is just not me, but there are many greater minds than I who are saying that we're living right here at the time of redemption. The world that we live in right now is truly looking for a bedrock to establish, or a foundation, something to return back to a source. There are moments when a society loses confidence in its own words, and we're living in that time right now. The vocabulary still exists, and we'll hear it: justice, freedom, dignity, truth. These words are there, but they no longer really carry a stable meaning, and we all can see it. It's evident. They became banners that are waved in arguments and discussions, protest on the street, justice, freedom. All of the things that we just named are all listed in these banners and arguments and slogans. But rather than bridges being built for understanding, we've had some other result. And the result is a civilization that can debate endlessly and still fail to resolve anything essential, because we as a society has stopped agreeing on what really is, what a human being is, and what our moral obligations are, and what we should fear more than inconvenience. When that happens, people do something predictable. They look for a foundation, they look for a source, they go back to the ancients, they go back to sages, not because they have suddenly become religious, but because human life cannot endure slogans for very long. A person can float on fashionable ideas for a season, a family cannot, a school cannot, a nation cannot. Eventually, the weight of ordinary living and marriage, children, contracts, crime, suffering, death demands more than just slogans. It demands a moral structure that can be held, that can be observed, that can be embodied. My book argues that the Hebrew Bible has always claimed such a structure exists, and this structure that entered into history, particularly in force at Sinai. Sinai is the Torah's telling, and not merely a spiritual peak. It's a national revelation, a covenant event that birthed the nation of Israel, and it bound the people of Israel to that Torah. Yet the prophets insist that Sinai's meaning doesn't remain contained within Israel's story. They describe a future in which the nations themselves will be drawn toward moral clarity, toward God, the God of Israel, and recognizing that there is one true God of all. That tension, that is Israel's distinction, the covenant, and humanity's universal responsibility, is the burden of this book that I've written. It is also the hope that I feel will come to those who read the book. Now, let me explain what my book is and what it is not. This book is not an argument for replacing Judaism with something new, a Sinai 2.0 project or whatever. It's not a second coming event. It does not represent a new covenant intended to rewrite the old covenant. This claim is much more simpler, but much more demanding. The future described by the prophets is not a replacement of Sinai, but it's the world's recognition of Sinai's moral reality. What if that is true? And if it is true, then the newness of the end of days is not God changing his standards, not changing a new plan. The newness is going to be human perception that changes. What Isaiah calls the removal of the veil spread over the nations, when the veil lifts, the world becomes teachable again. The worlds regain meaning again. The words that we say of justice, freedom, and liberty, knowledge, wisdom, peace, those are not slogans. Then it becomes a reality when we truly understand the source of these moral ideas. Justice regains its authority. Worship is reordered again. Rivals of power and tribe and appetite and ideology actually will lose their claim to rule. Why? Because we realize who the source really is. A particular religion won't be able to say, well, we are the source of all of this knowledge. We're going to realize there is one only true source in the world, and that is the source itself, the divine. This book is also not going to be a political manifesto. Jerusalem is not a mascot. Israel is not a talking point. The prophets treat Zion as conventional meaning, not as entertainment. Anyone who uses prophecy to feed outrage or to justify cruelty has misunderstood prophecy at its root. Finally, this book is not written to satisfy curiosity about dates. The prophets do not give a timeline to thrill a reader. I am not going to give you a timeline or a date or what this is even going to look like. I have no idea how this is going to unfold. But I do know this: when it unfolds and we see the result, we will know that we have experienced the Second Sinai moment. What will we be looking for is a way for society to wake up. Now, we hear the word, the Great Awakening. It's an overused term, but that's the only way that we can describe this. What is coming is a day of great awakening, great understanding. Now, let's look at the idea of why this matters. Why does Sinai matter to the nations? Now, a reasonable reader might ask, if Sinai was given to Israel, why should the nations even care? I would say because Sinai makes a claim that modern life quietly depends on, even when it denies it. That moral order was not invented and is not invented by power or authority, but by God himself. The modern world often tries to ground ethics in consensus, utility, on personal autonomy. Those frameworks can produce pockets of decency sometimes for long stretches. In our own society, in Western society, we've seen that happen. But they are fragile under pressure because they lack a higher court. When the crowd shifts, ethics shift. When fear intensifies, ethics collapse. When identity is threatened, truth becomes negotiable. Sinai's claim is the opposite. There is a higher court, and the human world is accountable to it. If that claim is true, It stabilizes everything else. It means justice is not theater. It means truth is not a tool. It means that human dignity is not a social invention. It means history is answerable. That is why the Torah insists on Sinai's public nature. It is not a private mystical vision belonging to one charismatic religious leader. It's not claimed foundation even to a nation, an event meant to bind a people in a way of life. And the prophets describe something even larger, and that is nations eventually recognizing this moral reality is not merely Israel's inheritance, but humanity's needed foundation. Now, just a note on Israel's distinct covenant. I really attempt strongly to honor a boundary set by the sages that have guarded seriously the Torah and Israel's covenant, curriculum, comprehensive identity, forming obligation, and bearing. But at the same time, rabbinic tradition articulates a universal moral floor that we all know as the Noahide laws. This framework is a framework that has been given to humanity since the time of Adam. And this has been humanity's baseline obligation. And for some reason, humans have wandered away from it or repositioned it or reframed it in other religious views. It is what it is. But this book treats that framework not as a modern invention, not as a slogan, not as a moral architecture. Courts and justice, reverence for God, protection of life, sexual integrity, poverty, trust, and restraint from cruelty, and the refusal of idolatry as moral confession and not a moral confusion. This distinction prevents two errors, and that is erasing Israel by universalizing the Torah in a way that dissolves covenantal particularity, and excluding the nations by treating moral truth as a tribal property rather than divine reality. The prophetic vision is not erasure. It is convergence. Many people learning to walk under the authority and guidance of one true God. I've constructed this book in a very particular way. I think I mentioned this the other day to someone that as long as I've been out of the church and I'm no longer a pastor, I still have a shepherd's heart. I have a pastor's heart. I can't help it. When people call me and ask for guidance or direction, I can't help but feel compassion and want to help direct and lead them in the proper path. If and when you read this book, please don't read it as information. If you're going to read it just as information, it's not worth the money that you're going to spend on it. If you look at the intention and focus on the intention of it, I have the feeling that it has a transformative effect. Even in writing the book, I began to re-examine my own self. Each chapter is structured to do three things: explain a biblical idea or rabbinic claim with precision, interpret the moral logic between the claim, and train the reader toward practice, toward walking it out, not just merely agreeing with it, not just giving it a nod head and say, oh, these are great ideas. This is why the book repeatedly returns to the language of speech, justice, and daily habits. Prophecy doesn't aim at intellect alone. It aims at human consciousness. And the human consciousness is only really stabilized when it becomes practiced. Now, here's the challenge that is presented to you that's quiet in the background. If the God of Israel is real and his moral order is real, then the only honest question is not, is inspiring, but what does it require of me? A person can admire justice and still manipulate. A person can speak truth and still exaggerate, pontificate. A person can praise God's oneness and still worship control, reputation, tribe, and appetite. You see, the prophets do not permit that division. They envision a future where humanity becomes teachable, where speech is purified, where justice is credible, and where the knowledge of God fills the earth, as it is quoted, as the waters cover the sea. That future does not begin with spectacle, it begins with readiness. So if you feel the world shaking and you're tired of floating on slogans, and you suspect that moral reality is not negotiable, then you are intended to be the reader of this book. Not because you are already certain, but because you're willing to be taught. And that willingness, my friend, is the prophetic imagination. It is where the veil begins to tear. It is where we as humans can begin to peer up through this veil and begin to see it thinned. May Hashem help us in our journey toward improving ourselves, destroying all lies about ourselves and illusions that we think and ideas that we think, and begin to improve ourselves so that we elevate not only in ourselves individually, but our family, our community, our nation, and the world. May it be so in this day.